The history of the radio. This video will go in depth and take a look at the history of all types of radios, including crystal radios, valve, vacuum tube type radios, and transistor radios, as well as a bit of information about radio broadcasting. Firstly, we'll start off by looking at crystal radios. A crystal radio receiver, also called a crystal set, is a simple radio receiver, popular in the early days of radio. It uses only the power of the received radio signal to produce sound, needing no external power. It is named for its most important component, a crystal detector, originally made from a piece of crystalline mineral such as galena. This component is now called a diode. Crystal radios are the simplest type of radio receiver and can be made with a few inexpensive parts, such as a wire for an antenna, a coil of wire, a capacitor, a crystal detector, and earphones, because a crystal set has insufficient power for a loudspeaker. However, they are passive receivers, while other radios use an amplifier powered by current from a battery or wall outlet to make the radio signal louder. Thus, crystal sets produce rather weak sound and must be listened to with sensitive earphones, and can receive stations only within a limited range of the transmitter. The rectifying property of a contact between a mineral and a metal was discovered in 1874 by Carl Ferdinand Braun. Crystals were first used as a detector of radio waves in 1894 by Jagadish Chandra Bose, in his microwave optics experiments. They were first used as a demodulator for radio communication reception in 1902 by G. W. Pickard. Crystal radios were the first widely used type of radio receiver, and the main type used during the wireless telegraphy era. Sold and homemade by the millions, the inexpensive and reliable crystal radio was a major driving force in the introduction of radio to the public, contributing to the development of radio as an entertainment medium with the beginning of radio broadcasting around 1920. Around 1920, crystal sets were superseded by the first amplifying receivers, which used vacuum tubes. With this technological advance, crystal sets became obsolete for commercial use but continued to be built by hobbyists, youth groups, and the Boy Scouts mainly as a way of learning about the technology of radio. They are still sold as educational devices, and there are groups of enthusiasts devoted to their construction. Crystal radios receive amplitude-modulated, AM, signals, although FM designs have been built. They can be designed to receive almost any radio frequency band, but most receive the AM broadcast band. A few receive shortwave bands, but strong signals are required. The first crystal sets received wireless telegraphy signals broadcast by spark gap transmitters at frequencies as low as 20 kHz. Crystal radio was invented by a long, partly obscure chain of discoveries in the late 19th century that gradually evolved into more and more practical radio receivers in the early 20th century. The earliest practical use of crystal radio was to receive Morse code radio signals transmitted from spark gap transmitters by early amateur radio experimenters. As electronics evolved, the ability to send voice signals by radio caused a technological explosion around 1920 that evolved into today's radio broadcasting industry. In the later years, while it never gained the popularity and general use that it enjoyed at its beginnings, the crystal radio circuit is still used. The Boy Scouts have kept the construction of a radio set in their program since the 1920s. A large number of prefabricated novelty items and simple kits could be found through the 1950s and 1960s, and many children with an interest in electronics built one. Building crystal radios was a craze in the 1920s, and again in the 1950s. Recently, hobbyists have started designing and building examples of the early instruments. Much effort goes into the visual appearance of these sets as well as their performance. Annual Crystal Radio DX contests, long-distance reception, and building contests allow these set owners to compete with each other and form a community of interest in the subject. A crystal radio can be thought of as a radio receiver reduced to its essentials. It consists of at least these components: an antenna in which electric currents are induced by radio waves, a resonant circuit, tuned circuit, which selects the frequency of the desired radio station from all the radio signals received by the antenna. The tuned circuit consists of a coil of wire, called an inductor, and a capacitor connected together. The circuit has a resonant frequency, and allows radio waves at that frequency to pass through to the detector while largely blocking waves at other frequencies. One or both of the coil or capacitor is adjustable, allowing the circuit to be tuned to different frequencies. In some circuits a capacitor is not used and the antenna serves this function. As an antenna that is shorter than a quarter wavelength of the radio waves it is meant to receive is capacitive. A semiconductor crystal detector that demodulates the radio signal to extract the audio signal. Modulation. The crystal detector functions as a square law detector, demodulating the radio frequency alternating current to its audio frequency modulation. The detector's audio frequency output is converted to sound by the earphone. Early sets used a Catwisco detector, consisting of a small piece of crystalline mineral such as galena with a fine wire touching its surface. The crystal detector was the component that gave crystal radios their name. Modern sets use modern semiconductor diodes, although some hobbyists still experiment with crystal or other detectors. An earphone to convert the audio signal to sound waves so they can be heard. The low power produced by a crystal receiver is insufficient to power a loudspeaker, hence earphones are used. As a crystal radio has no power supply, the sound power produced by the earphone comes solely from the transmitter of the radio station being received, via the radio waves captured by the antenna. The power available to a receiving antenna decreases with the square of its distance from the radio transmitter. Even for a powerful commercial broadcasting station, if it is more than a few miles from the receiver the power received by the antenna is very small, typically measured in microwatts or nanowatts. In modern crystal sets, signals as weak as 50 p-watts at the antenna can be heard. Crystal radios can receive such weak signals without using amplification only due to the great sensitivity of human hearing, which can detect sounds with an intensity of only 10-16 W/cm2. Therefore, crystal receivers have to be designed to convert the energy from the radio waves into sound waves as efficiently as possible. Even so, they are usually only able to receive stations within distances of about 25 miles for AM broadcast stations, although the radio telegraphy signals used during the wireless telegraphy era could be received at hundreds of miles, and crystal receivers were even used for transoceanic communication during that period. Now we'll move on to vacuum tube type radios, but also talk a bit about the vacuum tubes themselves. A vacuum tube, electron tube, valve, British usage, or tube, North America, is a device that controls electric current flow in a high vacuum between electrodes to which an electric potential difference has been applied. The type known as a thermionic tube or thermionic valve utilizes thermionic emission of electrons from a hot cathode for fundamental electronic functions such as signal amplification and current rectification. We'll quickly look at broadcasting and then come back to vacuum tubes. The Dutch company Nederlandsche Radio Industrie and its owner-engineer, Hanso Eidzeder, made its first regular entertainment radio broadcast over station PCGG from its workshop in The Hague on 6 November 1919. The company manufactured both transmitters and receivers. Its popular program was broadcast 4 nights per week using narrowband FM transmissions on 670 meters, 448 kHz, until 1924 when the company ran into financial trouble. Regular entertainment broadcasts began in Argentina, pioneered by Enrico Telemaco Suzzini and his associates. At 9 p.m. on August 27, 1920, Sociedad Radio Argentina aired a live performance of Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal from the Coliseo Theatre in downtown Buenos Aires. Only about 20 homes in the city had receivers to tune in this program. On the 31st of August 1920, the Detroit News began publicized daily news and entertainment Detroit News radiophone broadcasts, originally as licensed amateur station 8MK, then later as WBL and WWJ in Detroit, Michigan. Union College in Schenectady, New York began broadcasting on October 14, 1920, over to AD, an amateur station licensed to Wendell King, an African-American student at the school. Broadcasts included a series of Thursday night concerts initially heard within a 100-mile, 160 kilometers, radius and later for a 1,00-mile, 1,600 kilometers, radius. In 1922 regular audio broadcasts for entertainment began in the UK from the Marconi Research Centre 2MT at Writtle near Chelmsford, England. Now we'll get back to vacuum tubes and vacuum tube radios. During the mid-1920s, amplifying vacuum tubes, or thermionic valves in the UK, revolutionized radio receivers and transmitters. John Ambrose Fleming developed a vacuum tube diode. Lita Forrest placed a screen, added a grid electrode, creating the triode. Early radios ran the entire power of the transmitter through a carbon microphone. In the 1920s, the Westinghouse Company bought Lita Forrest's and Edwin Armstrong's patent. During the mid-1920s, amplifying vacuum tubes, US/thermionic valves, UK, revolutionized radio receivers and transmitters. Westinghouse engineers developed a more modern vacuum tube. The first radios still required batteries, but in 1926 the battery eliminator was introduced to the market. This tube technology allowed radios to be powered through the grid instead. They still required batteries to heat up the vacuum tube filaments, but after the invention of indirectly heated vacuum tubes, the first completely battery-free radios became available in 1927. In 1929 a new screen grid tube called UY224 was introduced, an amplifier designed to operate directly on alternating current. A problem with the early radios was fading stations and fluctuating volume. The invention of the superheterodyne receiver solved this problem, and the first radios with a heterodyne radio receiver went for sale in 1924. But it was costly, and the technology was shelved while waiting for the technology to mature, and in 1929 the Radiola 66 and Radiola 67 went for sale. A quick mention of loudspeakers. In the early days one had to use headphones to listen to radio. Later loudspeakers in the form of a horn of the type used by phonographs, equipped with a telephone receiver, became available. But the sound quality was poor. In 1926 the first radios with electrodynamic loudspeakers went for sale, which improved the quality a lot. At first the loudspeakers were separated from the radio, but soon radios would come with a built-in loudspeaker. Other inventions related to sound was the automatic volume control, AVC, first commercially available in 1928. In 1930 a tone control knob was added to the radios. This allowed listeners to improve imperfect broadcasting. The magnetic cartridge, which was introduced in the mid-20s, greatly improved the broadcasting of music. When playing music from a phonograph before the magnetic cartridge, a microphone had to be placed close to a horn loudspeaker. The invention allowed the electric signals to be amplified and then fed directly to the broadcast transmitter. Moving on to transistor radios. Following development of transistor technology, bipolar junction transistors led to the development of the transistor radio. In 1954, the Regency Company introduced a pocket transistor radio, the TR-1, powered by a standard 22.5V battery. In 1955, the newly formed Sony Company introduced its first transistorized radio, the TR-55. It was small enough to fit in a vest pocket, powered by a small battery. It was durable, because it had no vacuum tubes to burn out. In 1957, Sony introduced the TR-63, the first mass-produced transistor radio, leading to the mass market penetration of transistor radios. Over the next 20 years, transistors replaced tubes almost completely except for high-power transmitters. By the mid-1960s, the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, were using metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors, MOSFETs, in their consumer products, including FM radio, television and amplifiers. Metal oxide semiconductor, MOS, large-scale integration, LSI, provided a practical and economic solution for radio technology, and was used in mobile radio systems by the early 1970s. A quick mention of car radios. The first car radio was introduced in 1922, but it was so large that it took up too much space in the car. The first commercial car radio that could easily be installed in most cars went for sale in 1930. Now a brief bit of history about audio transmission. In the late 1890s, Canadian-American inventor Reginald Fessenden came to the conclusion that he could develop a far more efficient system than the spark gap transmitter and coherer receiver combination. To this end he worked on developing a high-speed alternator, referred to as an alternating current dynamo, that generated pure sine waves and produced a continuous train of radiant waves of substantially uniform strength, or, in modern terminology, a continuous wave, CW, transmitter. While working for the United States Weather Bureau on Cobb Island, Maryland, Fessenden researched using this setup for audio transmissions via radio. By fall of 1900, he successfully transmitted speech over a distance of about 1.6 kilometers, 1 mile, which appears to have been the first successful audio transmission using radio signals. Although successful, the sound transmitted was far too distorted to be commercially practical. According to some sources, notably Fessenden's wife Helen's biography, on Christmas Eve 1906, Reginald Fessenden used an Alexanderson alternator and rotary spark gap transmitter to make the first radio audio broadcast, from Brant Rock, Massachusetts. Ships at sea heard a broadcast that included Fessenden playing O Holy Night on the violin and reading a passage from the Bible. Around the same time American inventor Leda Forrest experimented with an arc transmitter, which unlike the discontinuous pulses produced by spark transmitters, created steady continuous wave signal that could be used for amplitude-modulated, AM, audio transmissions. In February 1907 he transmitted electronic telharmonium music from his laboratory station in New York City. This was followed by tests that included, in the fall, Eugenia Farrar singing I Love You Truly. In July 1907 he made ship-to-shore transmissions by radio telephone, race reports for the annual Interlakes Yachting Association, ILIA, regatta held on Lake Erie, which was sent from the steam yacht Thelma to his assistant, Frank E. Butler, located in the Fox's Dock Pavilion on South Base Island. Alrighty, that will do it for this video folks. I hope you enjoyed this history video. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye for now.